I'm Ed Adams, and this is the weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Adoptions can be very difficult for genealogists. Oftentimes, this is by design, but the very nature of the situation presents certain challenges that must be overcome. A few states allow essentially unrestricted access to the original birth certificate once the adoptee is an adult, but most states have additional restrictions, while some states make it very challenging to obtain information that would help an adoptee find their birth family. As usual, the Family Search Wiki has loads of good information on how to develop a research strategy for adoption cases broken down by U.S. state. They also have information for adoption research in several other countries, although the information is not as expansive as their U.S. information. But what do you do when you find a case of adoption in your family before records were commonly kept? Before 1851, there were virtually no official adoption records in the United States, and after 1851 wasn't much better. It wasn't really until the 1900s that adoption record keeping started to become more uniform throughout the country. Well, these situations present a challenge, but in many cases it's not insurmountable. With a little traditional genealogical research, paired with some genetic genealogy, you can pair the adoptee in your family with their birth parents. Today I'll go over a case study of adoption in my own family. I first met Emma Howell of Bainbridge, Georgia, in the 1900 census. She and her husband, William Richard Howell, were the parents of my great-grandfather. She was born in Georgia, and her parents were always listed as being from South Carolina. Once I started researching her life to continue her line on back, I quickly realized that I had a real mystery on my hands. I knew from the marriage of Emma and William that Emma's maiden name was Howell. That struck me as a bit odd. I've certainly seen cases of cousins with the same surname marrying each other before, but in my experience that's been pretty rare. So my first instinct was that she was likely married prior to her marriage with William Richard Howell. Since it looked like she was possibly married to another Howell man, that made researching the first marriage license fairly simple. I found that while she had married William Richard in 1885, she had first married a man named William Thompson Howell in 1882, who appeared to have been William Richard's first cousin once removed. In her marriage license to William Thompson, her maiden name is listed as Carpenter. So, armed with that bit of information, I set out trying to map out her life before marriage. Looking at census records from 1880 in Haralson County, where she had gotten married, turned up nothing. There were no Carpenters at all, in fact. One county to the north, however, in Polk County, I found an Emma Carpenter who was the right age, born in Georgia, and whose parents were listed as having been from South Carolina. The trouble was that she wasn't living in a household of carpenters. Instead, she was living with a John and Rebecca Smith. Her relationship was reported as an adopted daughter, and there were 2 other adopted children living with the Smith family. My heart kind of sank at this point. Not only was Emma adopted, making finding her birth family a real challenge, but she was adopted by none other than John Smith. Emma was 19 in 1880, though, so my hope at this point was that perhaps the adoption had occurred between 1870 and 1880, and that I might find her with her birth family in the 1870 census. I was not so lucky. I found her in 1870, 1 county to the east in northern Paulding County, where she was living again with the Smith family. The 1870 census did have another clue in it, though. Along with Emma, a 12-year-old boy named James Carpenter was also living with the Smiths. Although it's certainly possible that James was a cousin of Emma's, a story was starting to take shape in my mind. There had been a Carpenter family with at least 2 children. Something must have happened to both the parents, resulting in the Smith family adopting James and Emma. That may not be exactly what happened, but this story gave me a hypothesis to work against. Emma was born in 1861, so I'd gotten as far back with her as the census could take me. Statewide registration of vital records in Georgia didn't start until 1919, so I knew there was no birth certificate to find, and the few birth record substitutes that are available returned nothing. I looked through probate and guardianship records for Carpenters and Smiths, but I found nothing in either Paulding or Polk County. In fact, I didn't find any records at all for Carpenters, which I found odd. I started to wonder if there was going to be yet another county involved. What I did have was a 12-year-old James Carpenter, He was almost certainly going to be findable in the 1860 census, and that was probably before the adoption took place, since Emma was born in 1861. So I went looking for James in 1860, and I found a James Carpenter of the right age in Cass County, which is now Bartow County, just a few miles north of where he was living in 1870. He was part of a fairly large family, with the head of household listed as a 27-year-old J.L. Carpenter, and the presumed mother listed as a 40-year-old Jane Carpenter. At first, I thought that the father was already dead by 1860, and that J.L. Carpenter was a much older brother. But Jane was almost certainly the mother, and to be J.L.'s mother, she would have to have been 13 when he was born. It's certainly possible, but very unlikely. It's possible that J.L. could have been a half-brother from a different marriage, though, so I needed to track further back and see what was up with that age difference. The first thing that I did, though, was to move forward in time, looking for J.L. and Jane Carpenter in 1870 and 1880. If I could find them, that would indicate that I perhaps had the wrong family. It would be very unusual at this time to give children to adoption from a family that was intact. Sure enough, I couldn't find any record of J.L. and Jane Carpenter after 1860. With that, I dug further into the family to see what the story was with those ages. Based on what I'd seen in the 1860 census, I would no longer be looking in Georgia. The heads of household and the children were all listed as having been born in South Carolina, including James, who was 2 years old in 1860. So if I was going to find J.L. and Jane in 1850, I would need to head to the Palmetto State. There, I quickly found a James L. Carpenter and a Jane Carpenter, and 3 children living in Anderson County. This time, both James and Jane were listed as 30 years old. That had me wondering if perhaps neither age was right for James L., and perhaps in 1860 he was 37 instead of 27. They had 2 girls and 1 boy. The ages all matched with the 3 eldest in 1860, and while the girls were only listed by initials, they matched with the names of the 2 eldest girls in 1860. The problem was the son. Although he matches the right age for the eldest son in 1860, named John, in 1850 his name is given as James T. That's certainly kind of close, but it's still an inconsistency that bothered me. My gut was telling me I had the right family, though, so I continued with my digging. I later found the Confederate service record for what turned out to be John T. Carpenter. He enlisted in the 60th Georgia Infantry in late April of 1862, about 2 miles away from where they were living in 1860. But he died not long after on June 5th. The death was listed as occurring in Paulding County, Georgia, so a good assumption is that he caught one of the many diseases commonly found in Civil War camps and died of that. Also, I found a marriage record for a James L. Carpenter marrying Jane Major in December of 1839 in Anderson County. Unless James got married at 6 years old, he most definitely wasn't 27 in 1860, so I made a note of the discrepancy, but tentatively wrote it off as a mistake unique to the 1860 census record. Now that I had a better idea of what age James L. Carpenter was, I went searching for what happened to him. Although he was likely around 40 by the time the Civil War started, service rates among the men in the South were extremely high. I felt like, while he may not have served in the Confederate Regular Army, he perhaps served in a local militia unit that I could get records on. While I did find a J.L. Carpenter in the Confederate service records, serving in Phillips Legion, a unit that did draw soldiers from Cass County, the man I found was serving in a company that was predominantly drawn from Cobb and Habersham counties. After investigating a bit further, I found that J.L. Carpenter in several censuses in Cobb County, and found his gravesite also in Cobb County. That J.L. seemed to have been about 10 years younger than the one I was looking for, and he lived until 1893, so that idea turned up nothing. I was unable to find any record of James L. or Jane's death, so thus far I've been unable to explain why Emma and her brother were orphaned. But I'm certain the answer is out there. I think perhaps a trip up to Bartow County and the surrounding area might be in order. With what I'd found, though, I was fairly convinced that James L. Carpenter and Jane Major were the parents of Emma Carpenter. But I felt like before I could make the assertion, I needed to back it up with DNA. Since my relationship to Emma and her family is neither directly paternal or maternal, neither the Y-DNA or the mitochondrial DNA tests were going to be useful for me. My existing autosomal test that I'd taken with Ancestry years before would hopefully have everything I needed to confirm who Emma's parents were. So I hop on over to Ancestry.com and check out my DNA matches. But I've got several thousand matches, so where do you even start looking? there's a couple of ways to thin down the crowd, and perhaps doing each of these could be useful. The first way is to run a simple search that matches for anyone who has the surname Carpenter appearing in their family tree. Now, this requires a few things. It requires that your match have a tree, which not all of them will, and it requires that the match be aware of their Carpenter heritage. I have many matches that have trees, but only have about 10 people populated, which is not enough to catch the surname of every ancestor who's contributed DNA to that person. Another way of thinning the herd is to search by geographic locations within your match trees. So for me, I might narrow down by Georgia to start with, or I could go all the way down to Polk, Paulding, or Bartow County. That will help me catch matches who have ancestors in the right area, but perhaps they've not come upon their Carpenter line just yet. In my case, I chose to go with the first option and just looked for the easy win by searching for Carpenters. This gave me a decent list of matches to work with, ranging from 53 centimorgans of shared DNA down to about 25 centimorgans. Looking at the 53 centimorgan match, I did find a line of Carpenters going back to an area of Georgia that is very near to Anderson County, South Carolina, where James L. marries Jane Major, but as I built out that family a bit, I started to feel like, while their Carpenters might be related to mine, it was likely a distant relationship that could not account for our 53 centimorgans of shared DNA. Looking through the rest of the tree, I realized I was certainly right. There were 4 other shared surnames from areas where my family of those surnames came from, and 1 shared ancestor. So I was distantly related to this person a few different ways, with the closest shared ancestor being a 4th great-grandfather. While that match could prove useful, it wasn't going to be my starting point. The next few matches were related to me through Emma Carpenter herself, which didn't really help me identify who Emma's parents were. But they weren't useless. I looked at their shared matches with me, and this would help me capture additional matches to analyze that weren't captured before, since they might not have had the name Carpenter in their family trees. I filed those shared matches away for later, but continued on down the original list of matches. Then I came upon a 44 centimorgan match who only had 5 people in their tree, but their father was a carpenter from one of my counties of interest in Georgia. It didn't take long to find that this match was my 3rd cousin, once removed, through Emma's presumed brother James. A 3rd cousin once removed is expected to share between 0 and 192 centimorgans with an average of 48. This was a perfect fit, and the fact that I couldn't find any other ways that I was related to this match, it looked to me like the presumed qualifier was no longer all that necessary. This was another useful match to pull shared matches from. Again, I filed those away for later and continued down the original list. The next match I looked at was a 43 centimorgan match whose mother was again from one of my counties of interest. So I spent some time building that family back. It took a couple of generations to get there, but I found a woman named Margaret Carpenter, who, as best as I could tell, was the daughter of a man named Thomas L. Carpenter. Now, Thomas was also born in South Carolina, but lived in what is now Bartow County, and is buried not far from where James L. Carpenter and his wife Jane lived. He was of the right age to potentially be James's father, so assuming that James was Emma's father and that Thomas was James's father, I did the math. That would make this match my 3rd cousin twice removed. With this relationship, you could expect to see anywhere from 0 to 166 centimorgans with an average of 38. 5 centimorgans off the average looks pretty promising, but this is really only one match that seems to indicate that James is the father of Emma. So recapping a bit here. I'm trying to use genetic genealogy to prove that James L. Carpenter and Jane Major were the parents of Emma Carpenter. I have several genetic matches who share Emma as a common ancestor, one who shares Emma's presumed brother, and one that shares James L. Carpenter's assumed father. Things are looking promising, but are still well within the not certain territory. What I really wanted to find was someone who descended from one of the other children seen living with James and Jane in the 1860 census. With that, I jumped back into my match list. I had a few dead-end matches that had families located in places of interest, but I encountered a few brick walls and I didn't want to waste a lot of time breaking through those walls when there were plenty more viable matches to work. I came upon a 41 centimorgan match that had family in Franklin County, Arkansas. If I hadn't been thorough in my traditional genealogy of James L. Carpenter, that wouldn't have meant anything to me. However, 2 of his older daughters that were living with him and Jane in 1860 moved to Franklin County, Arkansas after the assumed death of their parents. So, this looked like an interesting lead, and I started building that family out. I didn't have to build much before I found the daughter of the younger of the 2 Carpenter girls who moved to Franklin County. That made the 41 centimorgan match my fourth cousin, and the match quality was only 6 centimorgans off average for that relationship. This also made this match critical since they linked me to a known descendant of James L. Carpenter. I continued in this fashion until I had confirmed matches with 5 of James L. Carpenter's descendants, allowing me to take my traditional genealogical hunches, along with some good DNA matches, and confidently state that James L. Carpenter and Jane Major were the parents of Emma Carpenter, born in 1861. Now, I feel like I got lucky with my matches in this particular case study, but solving early adoption cases isn't impossible. It can be a real challenge, and depending on inherited genetics, you may need to seek out other people to test, which can be a challenge of its own. But if you find yourself depressed because you've discovered one of your 19th century ancestors was adopted, don't despair. Look at it as a great opportunity to expand your skills. You probably won't solve it in one sitting, but I'm confident that you can piece it together over time. If you've enjoyed this case study and feel like you learned something, please reach out to me on Twitter at the WGT Pod. If you'd like to see more content like this, think about leaving a review. Either way, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.